My name is Maja, and I present you here part of my PhD project. I did my PhD project together with my promoter Agnes Moors at Louvain in Belgium. And in my PhD, I focused on emotional behavior. To start my presentation, I would like you to think about emotional behavior and to think how we usually describe emotional behavior and what people usually say about emotional behavior. When you think about this, it's very common that you or other people say emotional behavior is irrational behavior, it's impulsive behavior, and emotional behavior is very often contrasted to instrumental behavior or reflective behavior. So emotional behavior is considered to be non-instrumental behavior and to be non-reflective behavior. And when you get advice from family or friends, they often tell you don't respond so emotionally, don't take an emotional decision, or don't let emotions guide you. So emotions are considered often very negative, or emotional behavior is considered negative. And it's often contrasted to cognition. So often we make a differentiation between emotion and cognition. And in my PhD, I focused on whether this impression that a lot of us have, and that is very common in folk psychology, whether we actually also find scientific evidence for this, or whether this is something that maybe we just have the impression that it is like this, but can actually misguide us when we do research about emotional behavior. To start with, I would like to define first a bit better what do I mean with instrumental and impulsive or non-rational behavior. I start with the instrumental behavior. Another word for instrumental behavior, or no, I have to say, so to make a distinction between behaviors, one way to do this distinction is to look at what is the mechanism that leads to the behavior. So what is the mechanism that is responsible for the behavior? And we look what are the elements that are in the mechanism that lead to the behavior. So what is in the explanation of the behavior, which elements are there represented. And by comparing this explanation, we can differentiate the different behaviors. To start with, we go to the goal-directed behavior. Goal-directed behavior, that's another word for instrumental behavior. And goal-directed behavior is defined as behavior for which you first, before you enact it, you calculated or you assessed the highest or the expected utility, and you selected the behavior with the highest expected utility. An expected utility, that is a calculation of the expectancy and the value. The expectancy is some kind of assessment, how likely is it that the behavior fulfills your goals, and the value is the value of fulfilling the goal. So imagine you are thirsty. The value is how much value does it have to not be thirsty anymore, so to fulfill, or to do something about your thirstiness. And the expectancy is like how much, what is the chance that if I drink, that I won't be thirsty anymore. Of course, this is not restricted to only one goal. It can also be for different goals. So one behavior can also satisfy different goals. But so the idea is you assess which behavior is the best behavior to satisfy my goals. And then we contrast this with stimulus-driven behavior. Stimulus-driven behavior is behavior that either this expected utility is not complete, so either you only have a representation of the value, so there's only, for instance, a goal incongruence, and you want to fulfill a goal, but you don't do the expectancy calculation, or you only have the expectancy but not the goal, or you have none of this. So here you could, for instance, say stimulus-driven behavior is a behavior where you just have an association between a stimulus feature and a behavior, and this association, if you activate this association, you trigger the behavior. So for instance, An example for this is what we heard before, this positive approach, negative avoid. So the idea that we approach positive stimuli and we avoid negative stimuli. This is an example for a stimulus-driven process, because we don't evaluate whether this leads us to our goals or not. So when we go back to emotional behavior and we look at how is emotional behavior explained by emotion theories, we can see that most of emotion theories, they explain emotional behavior with a stimulus-driven process. I don't go into details how the explanation look in detail, but for instance, appraisal theories, they have their goal incongruence, but they don't have an expectancy representation in their explanation of behavior. But emotion theories, they often, like they say, like what triggers the behavior is a stimulus-driven process, but they also talk about emotion regulation, and emotion regulation is a goal-directed process. But so the idea is here that first you have a stimulus-driven process eliciting a first action tendency, and then if you have enough resources, a goal-directed process can interfere and can later on regulate the initial stimulus-driven action tendency. So it's there are two processes that interact, but it's first a stimulus-driven, and only if you're lucky, it's also a goal-directed process. In my PhD, I tested an alternative dual process model, and this alternative dual process model puts much more weight on goal-directed processes. This model says that, there is evidence that goal-directed processes can also operate automatically, so there is no reason to assume that goal-directed processes can only come later. Goal-directed processes can also be very fast, and goal-directed processes have the advantage to lead to more optimal behavior because you adapt to the situation. It's not like that always the same stimulus feature lead to the same behavior without that you adapt if you don't reach your goal, but you have some kind of feedback loop. You see, I did not reach my goal, so next time I behave differently. So they are much, they're much more optimal. They lead to much more optimal behaviors. So this model says that because goal-directed processes can also operate automatically, they start almost or at the same time as stimulus-driven processes, and they compete with each other. And then, because the goal-directed process leads to more optimal behavior, the goal-directed process should in most cases win this competition and should determine the behavior. So here a quick summary of the differences of these two approaches. So common emotion theories, they think that emotional behavior is in most cases stimulus-driven, and the alternative model would say that they are goal-directed. The common emotion theories say that these processes operate sequentially, versus the alternative model says that they operate in parallel. And this is an important difference. Common emotion theories say that early action tendencies are stimulus-driven, versus the alternative model says that they are goal-directed. And this last point is what I talk about, or where I present you a study about in this presentation. Because, what is important about this last point, if we just measure like open behavior, or behavior where people had a lot of time to execute or to reflect about it, emotion theorists can always say, this was because emotion regulation is goal-directed. So it's crucial, or the crucial difference between these approaches is to show that early action tendencies are goal-directed, and that it's not only after emotion regulation, or that emotion regulation does not come afterwards and makes then the behavior goal-directed. Okay, so that is the research question of the study I present you today. To look at this, or to investigate this research question, we needed a method to measure early action tendencies. And we did so by using DMS for this. And we did this with an approach avoidance task, the task that you saw just before. So we trained participants first. They saw like a positive or a negative stimulus. And we trained them first to move their fingers. And with moving their fingers, so the index finger for approach or the thumb finger for avoidance, a mannequin moved closer to the picture for approach or away from the picture for avoidance. And what we did with the TMS was, so we trained them first to execute this movement, so they knew this movement is approach, the other movement is avoidance. And then we just showed them the picture, and we executed, or we gave an electric impulse to their primary motor cortex, and we measured the motor evoked potentials in their fingers. So we could measure how much before they executed the behavior, how much did they activate the muscles in their finger. And we compared the index finger and the thumb finger. So we could see if one was activated more than the other. We could see the person wanted to move this finger, so this person wanted to execute an approach movement, or this person wanted to execute an avoidance movement. And the person actually did not have to do the behavior then anymore. As long as we knew that this was trained well enough, this was enough. I have this, I'm not used to this pointer. Yeah, and in the study, we used an approach avoidance task. We did a preliminary experiment with the TMS method to show that we indeed find this stimulus-driven process, so that we can measure action tendencies in this way with this paradigm. And we used this to make a bit more complex design in the study I present you here. We had there an experimental group and a control group. And in the experimental group, we assumed, I can actually already go on further, we assumed that there is anyway this stimulus-driven process from positive approach, negative avoid. But we also installed a goal-directed process in the opposite direction. So we gave them a monetary reward for avoiding positive stimuli and approaching negative stimuli. So this was a goal-directed process, and this was in the opposite direction of the stimulus-driven process. And we expected, so if the alternative model is correct, we expected that this goal-directed process would be stronger than the stimulus-driven process, and that we would find with TMS the goal-directed action tendencies and not the stimulus-driven action tendencies. And this is against what common emotion theories say. They say at such an early moment you can only find the stimulus-driven action tendencies, and only if you give them more time, you would find the goal-directed ones. We also had a control group, and this control group we just used to see that the stimulus-driven process is indeed there, so that there is a process against which the goal-directed process has to compete. And then what did we find? Here you have to look at the positive bars. So if the bars, these are standardized scores of the motor evoked potentials. If the bars are positive, it means that this action tendency is activated. So what we see in the control condition is that with positive stimuli, they have a stronger tendency to approach, and with negative stimuli, a stronger tendency to avoid. And in the experimental condition, it's just the other way around. So expect, like we would expect it from the alternative model. So positive stimuli lead to a stronger tendency to avoid, and negative stimuli to a stronger tendency to approach. So the findings show that, yeah, first of all, that was just as a baseline, we saw there is a stimulus-driven process that is operating. But we also found that if we install a goal-directed process that goes against the stimulus-driven process, then this goal-directed process is stronger, and this goal-directed process determines the action tendencies that people show. Yeah, what does this mean for emotion theories or for emotional behavior? It means that we should be careful to assume that emotional behavior is stimulus-driven. Maybe in much more cases it's goal-directed, but we just assumed that it would be, or it made more sense that it's stimulus-driven. And it also, if there is more evidence corroborating this type of research, it also puts into question how we perceive emotion regulation, that emotion regulation is a separate process that comes after the process that elicits the emotion. And to conclude, or to come back to the question that I asked you before, when I did my PhD, I wondered then, why is it that we have such a strong impression that emotional behavior is irrational, or that we should avoid emotional behavior? And what I saw during my PhD, or what I think are different reasons for it, is that I think we have a very bad insight into the goals that lead us in our behavior. So if we ask people, why do you do something? It's very hard to tell, and it's also very hard to measure. I had some other studies where we tried to measure the goals implicitly of people, and it's very hard to really grasp these goals. And I think that is one of the reasons why, because we don't have so much insight in our goals, that how our goals lead our behavior, that we assume that emotional behavior might not be goal-directed. And related to this, I think it's problematic that when we study emotional behavior, we often use self-reports, because if we don't have a lot of insights into the goals that lead our behavior, it's also very hard for people to tell about their goals in self-reports. And self-reports could maybe reflect much more just what we think, what our folk psychology assumptions are about how emotional behavior is triggered, but not what is actually the mechanism that is responsible for this. And another point, the last reason why I think, or what could contribute to this impression, is also that in certain studies, people also that don't get a lot of choice how to behave. For instance, I did also research on social exclusion. How do people respond when they are social exclusion? And there it's often said that people respond aggressively to social exclusion. But when you look at the studies, people often did not get any other option than aggressive behavior. So people could just, they were socially excluded in a study, and then they could just decide between more or less aggression, but they could not decide for a behavior that had a higher expected utility. So then maybe people just thought, okay, I want to do something about this situation, I want to change this situation, so I just take whatever people give me or whatever the options are that I can do. And this is an aggressive behavior, but this does not mean that people would not take another option if they would have another option. So I think we have to be very careful in how we design the studies and what kind of conclusions we draw from this, that we don't too fast say this situation leads to this behavior. And as a general note, I think we should be very careful before we judge that the behavior is stimulus-driven or goal-directed. We should really look at this or investigate this very carefully. And also what I saw is that people often assume, or it's sometimes not made very explicit, that the behavior is assumed to be goal-directed, but when you look at the explanation they give, one of the parts of a goal-directed explanation is always missing. So people have some kind of vague idea of a goal-directed behavior, but I think we should be very careful to make the explanations that we give or the mechanism that we propose for a behavior very explicit, and are there very careful to make the distinction between, or to say when we assume that it's goal-directed, that we really make sure that all the elements of a goal-directed process are really represented in the explanation. That was it from me. I added here some references in case you would like to know a bit more about, or a bit more details about the study, or also about the models. I also, the model is developed by my promoter, Agnes Moors. I applied the model to emotional behavior, but there are also 2 other PhD students. One of them applies it to habits, and the other one applies it to environmental behavior, environmental friendly behavior. I saw that some presentations are about this, so it might also be interesting to look at their work. Thank you for your attention.